In this lesson, we're going to learn about arcs and how we can create smooth motion with a graph editor. So the principle, or the animation principle of arcs, states that almost everything in nature and almost every living thing moves in an arcing motion. Now I've opened up 10_begin and we have this animation on our camera. And the motion that we like to see is an arcing motion. It's sort of a calming and appealing motion. However, most of the time in After Effects, we usually create very linear motions and very jumpy motions. Now here I've gone in and I've tried using traditional methods to smooth out this animation as much as possible. Well, we can still see at certain points we have a pretty not large jump, but we definitely have a change in direction and we have a bump in our camera's movement. Now what I'd like this to be a continuous and smooth movement and a continuous arc. So up to this point, I've set a few pose keyframes, and then I've gone in and selected this layer and jumped into the different camera angles. And I've tried to make this path arcing. So you can see here we have our animation path, and I've tried to add arcs in. Now, if you wanted to continue doing this, you could, of course, come in and select these keyframes and modify their Bezier handles. However, this takes a little bit of time, and it's not a 100% method. Now, during this lesson, or before this lesson, I've gone in and I've added in more keyframes, because that's usually what we try to do whenever we are having a problem in After Effects. If the motion is not looking correct, let's add in more keyframes to really control where the camera is. However, for the most part, that just adds jerky movement and causes more problems. So let's take an alternate look at how we can use the principle of arcs to smooth out our camera motion and create a much more appealing shot. So to begin with, I'm going to go to the position, and you can see I'm using 100% auto Bezier keyframes. Now sometimes this does smooth out the motion, but usually After Effects isn't really smart enough to completely smooth out that motion. So what we need to do is we need to actually go in and take a look at the movement curves that are happening. So let's select position and let's open up our graph editor. Now if you've taken a look at this before and gone, what is going on here? You're probably in the majority. The position graph editor is a little bit strange. It is running off of acceleration. So what we're seeing is not actual movement, but we're seeing is changes in speed. So right here we're accelerating or moving at 50 pixels per second, and then we're slowing down to 42 pixels, eventually slowing down to 7, and then we begin picking up speed later on. Now each of these bumps here, or each of these large changes, will cause a jostling or a shifting of our camera. Now we could come in here and try to manipulate these, but again the interface isn't really super easy to use. So what I prefer to do is I prefer to break position into the XYZ pieces, and we can do that with this button down here. And now we have access to each of the individual axes. So now let's come in and begin looking at this. So let's begin with our X position. Now again, here if you see a bump, that is going to mean that the camera is shifting movement quickly. Now this is actually a mapping of the actual X position of our camera. So you can see there are some areas, and this control is very similar. You can hold space to move in and out. You can hold Alt and drag to the right to zoom in, and you could also use these down here. So we can see that our X keyframes are acting a little bit strange. So to begin with, let's select all of our keyframes and let's set them to auto. So that will flatten those out and we get this graph, and some of these look good and some of them look a little worse. So the next step I like to do is I actually like to eliminate keyframes whenever I can. Because if you do not need a keyframe there, it's probably causing you trouble. So let's go in, and wherever there's a keyframe, essentially just sitting in the middle of two other keyframes, let's go in and remove it. And let's do that here, and let's remove this one. And what we have is a much flatter graph. Now at this point, the X is still having these little bumps. So what we need to do is we need to go into each of these keyframes and let's just drag out their Bezier handles a little bit. And that will smooth out the transition in and out of that keyframe. So I'm just going to come over here and do that to these keyframes as well. And again, this is only if you want a smoother movement. If you want a sharper movement, we can bring these keyframes in and we can actually hold Alt and we can break the tangent handles. So at this point here, this is almost like a hit. So this kind of a curvature would show hitting a wall and then recoiling off. Now, if you break your Bezier handles and they've gotten to a point where you just want to reset it, you can always come back here and convert the selected keyframes to something like the Auto Bezier. All right, so let's look at our curve, and that looks pretty good. You almost always want to start the curve at a non-hole or a non-Bezier keyframe, so you want to start your action with a little bit of movement. So that's why we have this first keyframe at almost a linear to the next keyframe. All right, so let's apply this again to our Y position. So let's come in here and look for keyframes that we don't need and eliminate them. And the rest, let's convert to Auto Bezier and fix their tangencies. So we'll come in and pull these out. And we might not even need this one. And remember, it's okay to remove keyframes. Now, this is going to slightly change our motion, so we do have to be conscious of that. However, we're going to be trading, essentially, the consistency or the accuracy of many keyframes for the smooth movement of less keyframes. So on our Z-axis, it looks like we can almost cut out almost every single keyframe and then just have that curvature with these Bezier handles. Oops. Don't want to modify that with everything selected, so let's pull these out, and we should be good to go with our position keyframes. Now, at this point, you essentially have the idea, and so you can continue to do this for all of the rotational values. Again, removing keyframes where we do not need them, and extending out the Bezier handles wherever we have them. And some of these, when we only have 2 keyframes, we may want to pull these in to have more of an ease in to the final pose. And for now, let's leave that there. And finally, on our X rotation, it looks like we can remove a keyframe and again, just slightly modify the Bezier handles to create that nice arcing motion. Okay, so now that that's done, let's jump back to our active camera. And as you can see on our motion path, we have a much smoother and a much nicer looking motion path. So let's now take a look at what this looks like inside of our animation. So I'm going to pause the video while this RAM previews, and then we'll take a look, and then we'll take a look at one last thing we can do to create even smoother motion and to break up any bumping that we still have going on in our scene. Okay, so now we can see the motion we have is much, much smoother. We still have a little bit of things to iron out. And of course, since we came in and modified our keyframes quite a bit, we probably still want to go in and make sure that our major poses are working correctly. It looks like we need to rotate on the Y-axis a little bit more here. So let's go back to our Y rotation, and let's go to this keyframe here. And let's maybe let's see where our major poses are. Maybe set another keyframe right here. Let's go to this value. And it looks like it's not the Y rotation, but actually the Z rotation we need to modify to recenter our asset. So once you've made sure your poses are correct, let's go back and just make sure we're doing one final tweak here. Okay, so let's take a look. And let's flatten that out. Okay, great. Now the last thing we can do to make this even smoother is slightly offset all our keyframes from each other. So I'm just going to select the keyframes of the Y and Z, and I'm just going to move them back a little bit. And all we're doing here is offsetting the beat. So we're changing the timing of when these things will land. And what that does is if the rotation and the various position values change on different frames, it's less likely that our mind is going to see that as a unified movement, because we are now essentially breaking these apart and changing them or making sure they hit on different frames. So it looks like a mess, and it's a little difficult, or more difficult, to modify now, but if we take a look at our final movement, I think you'll agree that it is much improved over what we started with. So I'm going to pause the video while this RAM previews, and then we can take a look at our final arcing motion. So here the RAM preview just finished, and while we do have acceleration and deceleration, you can see that the movement is much more fluid and much more smooth than what we started with. So remember, try and keep your movement and try and keep your animation in an arcing fashion, because having linear things, again, is very mechanical, it's very unnatural, and it's not what we're used to seeing. So things like cameras should have this nice kind of arcing motion, and sometimes we're going to have to get dirty and get into the keyframes themselves to be able to create this kind of arcing motion. So remember that you can break your position apart in the graph editor, and you can go in and modify each curve to create whatever kind of motion you like.